Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Aleph at the new Mishnah. Our Mishnah continues to discuss Eruv Chatzeros, specifically a scenario when you have two Chatzeros. You have an inner Chatzer and an outer Chatzer. The inner Chatzer has what's called Drisas Haregel. It can walk through the outer Chatzer. And in order to get to the Mavui or the Rishon Ram, he must go through the outer Chatzer. Our Mishnah discusses various scenarios, whether one made an Erev Chatzeros or they both made an Erev Chatzeros, as follows. Shtei Chatzeros zu lifnim mizu. Irva hapnimis v'lo irva hachitzoina. Hapnimis muteres v'hachitzoina asura. The first scenario is the inner Chatzer made an Eruv. The outer Chatzer did not make an Eruv. The inner Chatzer therefore will be valid to carry with a bayit from the bayis into the Chatzer, but the outer Chatzer will not be permitted to carry from the bayis to its Chatzer. The second scenario, hachitzoino v'loy hapnimis shteyem asus. Here it's the exact opposite in terms of the outer Chatzer made in Eruv. The inner Chatzer did not make an Eruv. Here, not only is the inner Chatzer going to be Oyser on itself because it didn't make an Eruv, but it will also Oyser the outer Chatzer. Since the inner Chatzer again has Drisas HaRegel, therefore when it's Oyser on its own, it's also going to be Oyser the outer Chatzer. Third scenario, Irvu zu v'la'atzma v'zu la'atzma. Each Chatzer made an Eruv on their own. The din is zu muteres b'fnei atzma, v'zu muteres b'fnei atzma. Each one will then be muter on its own. All of this according to the Tanakama. Rabbi Akiva oiser hachitzoina shedrisas haregel osarta. Here Rabbi Akiva says even though they both made an independent Erev Chatzeros, nonetheless the outer Chatzer is going to then be Osir, because since the inner Chatzer has Drisas HaRegel, and the way Rabbi Akiva views this as the inner Chatzer is part of as a resident of the outer Chatzer, so long as they did not make Erev Chatzeros between them, then the inner Chatzer will Oyser the outer Chatzer again, even though the inner Chatzer made an Erev Chatzeros and is valid to then use that Erev Chatzeros with its own Chatzer, but it will now Oyser the outer Chatzer because again it's a resident of the outer Chatzer according to Rabbi Akiva, and therefore since it did not make an Erev Chatzeros with the outer Chatzer, it will then Oyser it. V'chachamim oimrim ein drisas haregel oisarto, and the Chachamim say that the drisas haregel will not be Oyser. The Gemara will explain this statement. Now the Mishnah goes on to say, Shochach echad min hachitzoina v'lo eirav. Here we have a scenario again, the latter scenario where each Chatzer made their own independent Erev Chatzeros, but it states over here that one of the outer Chatzer he neglected to be included in the Erev Chatzeros. Hapnimis muteres v'achitzoina asura. The pnimis will then be mutter, it'll be independent of the outer one, but the outer one will be osir. Mina pnimis v'lo erev. If it's the opposite situation where the inner one, they did make an erev chatzeros, but the outer one did not. Sorry, the inner one, each one made their independent Erev Chatzeros, but the inner one, there was one person who neglected to make the Erev Chatzeros with them. The din is Shteyim Asuros. Again, parallel to the Tanakama above, that the same way that this inner Chatzer will be Oyser, similarly will also Oyser on the outer Chatzer. So even though it's true that everybody in the outer Chatzer made their Erev Chatzeros, but since there was one person who neglected in the inner Chatzer to make his inner Chatzeros, therefore not only will the inner Chatzer be Oyser, but it will also Oyser onto the outer Chatzer as being Drisas HaRegel. The Mishnah goes on to say, Nosnu eruvim b'makom echad, if they put their eruv in one place, meaning to say, here they did make an eruv chatzir with each other. The chatzir, in the inner chatzir, made an eruv chatzir with the outer chatzir, and they placed the eruv in one of the houses. V'shochach echad bein min hapnimis ubein min hachitzoyna, and one, either from the inside or the outer chatzir, neglected to be participating in this eruv chatzeros. V'lo erav shtein asuros, that will then prohibit both of the inner and the outer chatzir from then using the chatzir in terms of being metaltel a chayfetz. The Mishnah concludes, V'im hoyu yechid shel yechidim, if the two chatzeros were yechidim, there was an individual in each chatzir, then einan srichin la'arev. This is again the shita of the Tanakama, since the inner chatzir is going to be permissible to itself, therefore it will also then not prohibit the outer chatzir. This is the shita of the Tanakama. Now the Gemara is going to then explain to us what is the shita of the Chachamim that's stated in the Mishnah right after Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva stated over here, Oiser hachitzoyna shedrisas haregel oisarta. In a situation, says Rabbi Akiva, that each chatzir made their own erev chatzeros. So Rabbi Akiva says, nonetheless, the inner chatzir will oiser on the outer chatzir. Again, because Shitas Rabbi Akiva is that the inner chatzir is like a resident of the outer chatzir. So providing that they did not make an erev chatzir with the outer chatzir, then they will oiser on the outer chatzir. Now then the Mishnah brings a statement by the Chachamim. The Chachamim omrim, ein drisas haregel oisarta. The drisas haregel will not be oiser. Now what does the Chachamim mean to say? Do they mean to say, Aleph, that since that the inner chatzir would be mutter on their own, therefore they will not oiser on the outer one? Or do they mean to say even more, Beis, that even if they were oiser on their own, there will not be oiser on the outer one? They don't have any bearing. Their drisas haregel doesn't have any bearing to oiser on the outer chatzir. This is what the Gemara over here wants to explore. What is the shita of the Chachamim? Says the Gemara, Ki also Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yonai. Rav Dimi said the name of Rabbi Yonai. Zu divrei Rabbi Akiva. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. The Omer who said, Afilu regel hamuteres b'mekoima oisartish lo b'mekoima. Even though the inner chatzir is muter for itself, it will oiser on the outer chatzir, as we explained before, because it has drisas haregel, and Rabbi Akiva views it as being part of a residency as a resident of the outer chatzir. Aval, but this statement says, according to Rav Dimi and Rabbi Yonai, Chachamim oimrim keshem sheregel hamuteres eina oiseres, the same way that it's not going to then oiser the outer chatzir when it itself, the inner chatzir, is muter. Kach regel ha'oisura eina oiseres, even if the inner chatzir would be oser on itself. In a scenario where the inner chatzir did not make an eruv and the outer chatzir did make an eruv, still the Chachamim would say that the inner chatzir will not oiser the outer chatzir. That is the shita of the Chachamim. And if you come out with that, then it comes out that we have what seems to be a new shita that's explaining the Chachamim that says no matter what, the inner chatzir will not oiser the outer chatzir. That we haven't seen until now. Says the Gemara, Tnan, bringing the Mishnah, Irva chitzoyna v'lo pnimis shtei masuras. The Tanakama stated the following din, that the outer chatzir made an eruv, the inner chatzir did not make an eruv. Stays over here in the Tanakama, shtei in asuros. They're both aser. That means to say that not only is the inner chatzir going to be oiser for itself, it's going to also oiser on the outer chatzir. Ask the Gemara Mani, who is the author of this statement? Ilema Rabbi Akiva, then my area regel asura afilu regel muteres nami. Why mention regel that is osir, the inner chatzir that's osir is going to oiser the outer chatzir? According to Rabbi Akiva, even if the inner chatzir would be muter, it will oiser the outer chatzir. Elalav Rabbanon, rather it must be the Rabbanon, and therefore there must be a kasha on the way Rav Dimi, in the name of Rav Yonai, just stated the opinion of the Chachamim. He said that the Chachamim say in all scenarios the outer chutzner will remain mutter, the inner chutzner will not oiser the outer chutzner. Yet, over here we see that no, that the inner chutzner, if it's oser to itself, then it will also oiser the outer. If it's mutter to itself, it will not oiser the outer. Says the Gemara, La'olam Rabbi Akiva, you can even explain this last statement that we quoted before as Rabbi Akiva. We asked if it's Rabbi Akiva, he even says when both of them made their own Erev Chatzeros, then the inner one will oiser the outer one. Says the Gemara, because loy zu af zu kitani. Not only this is it oser in a scenario when he is going to then oiser, because he himself is going to be, even though he himself, the inner chutzner is mutter, will oiser on the outer one, but even, not only, rather the other way, not only in a scenario where the inner one did not make an Erev Chatzeros, will oiser on the outer one who did make an Erev Chatzeros, but even if the inner one did, yes, make an Erev Chatzeros, and is mutter, he will still oiser the outer Chatzeros, which made an Erev Chatzeros too, because, again, according to Rabbi Akiva, the inner Chatzar is a part and parcel of the outer Chatzar. He's a resident, so long, and therefore, as a Drisas Regel and a resident, he must make an Eruv within each other, and if he did not do that, then he will oiser on the outer Chatzar. Now ask the Gemara from another statement of the Tanakhama. Tnan. Ir v'zula atzma v'zula atzma. When both Chatzeros made their own Eruv, zu muteres b'fnei atzma, zu muteres b'fnei atzma. The Mishnah states the din is that each one is going to be muter on their own. Taimo the irvo. The Gemara makes a diuk. The reason is because the inner one made an Eruv. Haloi irva shtei masuros. If the inner one did not make an Eruv, they would both be Osir. V'ho, haitana, the Omar regel hamuteres, eino oiseres, regel asura oiseres. From this we see the statement in this Tana, that a regel that is muteres, that means the inner chotzer that is muter, will not oiser the outer one. Only if the inner one is Osir, will the oiser the outer one. Maniha, who's the author of this? So again, this would be a kasha, the way that the Rabbi Dimi said in the Rabbi Yonai, because this would imply that the Chacham say only when the inner chutzner is mutter will it not oiser the outer one, but if it's oser, it will oiser the outer one. The Gemara says, "Ilem Rabbi Akiva hi afilu regel muteres nami." Again, if it's Rabbi Akiva, he says if both of them made their own oyev chatzeros, still the inner one will oiser the outer one. Elolav rabbani. It must be the Rabbanan. And again, this would be the kasha that we just stated now on Rav Dimi and name Rabbi Yonai. V'oid, and further, mid the Seifa, from the fact that the Seifa of the Mishnah states Rabbi Akiva, it must be that Reisha lav Rabbi Akiva, that the earlier statements, what we say is the Tanakama, is not Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, who is it? It must be this, the Chachamim. It must be this Chachamim. And therefore, again, a kasha on Rav Dimi's version of the name of Rabbi Yonai, that states that the Chachamim hold in all scenarios, even when the inner Chatzar is oiser on its own, it will not oiser the outer Chatzar. Says the Gemara, no, Kuli Rabbi Akiva. We can even push this off and say the entire Reisha is also Rabbi Akiva. But how can that be? Rabbi Akiva comes along afterwards, is mashma that the Tana before is not Rabbi Akiva. Explains the Gemara, v'chesuri mechsera v'hochik tani. And there are missing words in the Mishnah, and we can fill them in as follows. Ir v'zula atzma v'zula atzma. When both Chatzeros made their own Erev Chatzeros, zumu teres b'fnei atzma v'zumu teres b'fnei atzma. Then the din is that each one is going to be mutter. Bamed dvar mamurim. This is where now we add words in the Mishnah. Bamed dvar mamurim she'asa saw daka. When is this true? When there was a short type of entranceway that was a doorway that was made between the inner and the outer chutzner, which separated the two. Then we will say that the inner one does not oiser the outer one. Aval loy oiser sadaka chitzoina oisra asura. Then, if it did not make this separation between the inner and outer chutzner, then the inner one will, yes, oiser the outer one. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. This is the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. The words of Rabbi Akiva. She Rabbi Akiva oiser es hachitzon mipnei shedir es haregel oiseres. Dris haregel oiseres. Because Rabbi Akiva is the sheet that the outer chatzor will become oser from the dris haregel of the inner one, and therefore the sheet of Rabbi Akiva is such that again, even if the inner one would be mutter, it will oiser the outer one. V'chachamim oimrim ein dris es haregel oiseres. Whereas the Chacham would be arguing, saying, no, if the inner one is going to be mutter, it will not oiser the outer one. It's only if the inner one is also will oiser the outer one. Now the Gemara asks, Mosiv Rav Bibi bar Abaye v'im hayushel yechidim ein tzrichin la'arav. The Seif, the Mishnah stated that if you have an inner chutzner and an outer chutzner, and each one is only being resided by one individual, that means the inner chutzner does not need an erev chatzeros. It's mutter, and the din is that it's not oyster on the outer one. Either one doesn't need an eruv. Diuk ha shel rabim tzrichin la'arei. But if indeed there was the pnimius had rabbi more than one, it would need an eruv. Alma, we see from here regel hamuteres b'mekayma ein oyseres. That means that the inner one, if it would make an eruv, it would be mutter, and it would not oyser the outer one. Regel ha'asura oyseres. But if it was oyser because it did not make an eruv, it will yes oyser the outer one. V'oid, and further, Mosiv Ravina shochach echad min hachitzon v'lo erev. That we said in a scenario where both chatzeros made their own eruv, but one of the outer person neglected to be included in the eruv, then hapnimis muteres v'chitzoyna asura. The inner one will be muter, while the outer one will be osir. Shochach echa min hapnimis. However, in the reverse scenario, where the inner chutzner, somebody neglected to be included in the chutzner, v'lo eirav shtei and asuros. The din is that not only is the inner one going to be osir, but even the outer one will be osir. Time of the shochach. The only reason is because one person from the inner chutzner neglected to make an eruv to be included. Haloi shochach. But if not, then shtei and mutaros. Then they would both be mutar, not only the inner one, but even the outer one. Alma regel hamuteres eina oiseres. The inner chutzner does not oiser the outer one. Regel asura oiseres. Only if the inner one is also will oiser the outer one. So it comes out that indeed, we see over here that there's going to really be three shitas. We cannot then put these words on the chachamim that we said before as follows. Ella ki oser Ravin amar Rabbi Yonai. Ravin then is said in the name of Rabbi Yonai, differently than Rav Dimi. To explain, he said that really comes out the same shita, but it comes out that there are three different shitas to explain the Mishnah. There's the shita of the Tanakama, the shita of Rabbi Akiva, and the shita of the Chachamim, as follows. The Tanakama holds that when the inner chutzner is mutter, then it's not oyser the outer chutzner. It's only if the inner chutzner is oyser, then it oyser the outer chutzner, because of its drisas regel. According to Rabbi Akiva says, not only is the inner chutzner going to oyser the outer chutzner when it itself is oyser, but even when it itself is mutter, it will oyser the outer chutzner, because it's a resident of the outer chutzner. And then we have now a third sheet. This is the Chachamim. And the Chachamim, when they stated their words, ein drisas haregel oisarta, means in all scenarios, even in the inner chutzner was osir in itself, so long as the outer chutzner made its own erev, it will not oiser the outer chutzner, as follows. Gimel machloikis badavar. There are three different shitas in our Mishnah. Tanakama sova regel hamuteres eina oiseres. Regel hasura oiseres. Only again, when the inner one is going to be osir, will the oyser the outer one. Rabbi Akiva savar afilu regel hamuteres oiseres. Even if the inner one is going to be muter, will oyser the outer. V'rabbanan basroi, not the Tanakama, but the Rabbanan basroi, the word that we have the Chachamim that stated v'Chachamim oimrim ein drisas haregel oisar. That mean in all cases, kisavreish kishem sheregel muteres eina oiseres kach regel hasura eina oiseres. And these really are the words of Rabbi Rabbi Yonai from the beginning, that which we quoted before in the beginning, Rav Dimi and Rabbi Yonai, this is what he said, and this is the sheet of the Chachamim, that when the inner chatzar, no matter what it does, whether it makes it's also or it's mutter, it will not have a bearing. Its Dris will not have any bearing on it being oyser the outer chatzar.